Hello everybody, and welcome to my War of the Spark limited set review. Today we are going to be talking about the white cards, working our way from the commons all the way to the rares and mythics. But before I dive in, I do want to remind you that if you enjoy the video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. If this video gets to 50 thumbs up, 50, I guarantee that I will be making future installments of the limited set review for the other colors. If you would like to vote on which color you want to see next, be sure to leave that in the comments section down below. Also, speaking of the comments section, if you have any questions at all about the cards I'm talking about or about War of the Spark, be sure to ask those in the comments section. I really do love interacting with you and helping prepare you for your pre-release and your first drafts. Another thing I do want to say is if you want to get updates for whenever I post future installments in the set review or draft videos for War of the Spark, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It really does help me out a ton, and it's a great way to join the team. But without further ado, let's get into the cards, starting with the white cards. I do want to say I'm going to be using Scryfall for this video. It is a really nice site for looking up cards. I highly recommend it, and I will be leaving a link to that in the comments section in a pinned comment. Also, before I talk about the cards, I want to mention my grading scale. I don't really believe in grading scales overall because a lot of the cards are quite clearly better than other cards. And it's all very contextual. You're never really going to have to pick your team out of all of the card options. So it's generally just a pick between 2 or 3 cards, and all that matters is which one's the best between those. But I will give a grading scale because people love a good grading scale. At the top of the grading scale, I have 5s. 5s are the incredible cards, the bombs, the best of the best. Those are usually the rares and mythics, though there are sometimes really good uncommons as well. Not usually commons, but sometimes there are exceptions. So those are the best of the best. 4 are strong cards. 4s are cards that actively draw you into that color combination. If you have a couple of 4s, you generally want to be playing that color combination. If you get a 4 card late, then generally it's a pretty strong signal that that color might be open. 3s are your average cards. As LSV would say, they are the pawns of limited. They're just your everyday run-of-the-mill cards. 2s are below average. You sometimes play them, but you're not always very happy when you have to play them. And then the 1s are unplayable. And then there's some 3.5s and 4.5s and stuff like that. So let's get into, first of all, I'll pull up my top 5 commons for white, but let's go through the cards. Battlefield Promotion is the first card. It is, I'll leave it up on the screen so you can read it. And I think Battlefield Promotion is a pretty solid card. First of all, because Proliferate is in the set, so you want to have ways to put +1/+1 counters on your creatures, and also because there are some minor, there's an Ajani's Pridemate in the set, so life gain is slightly relevant if you have Ajani's Pridemate, but generally just Battlefield Promotion is going to be a decent card. I think it's actually going to be better than it would be in a normal set because Proliferate is so important, and because there's not all that many ways to put +1/+1 counters on your creatures. So I think Battlefield Promotion is going to be a solid 3. It's going to be a combat trick that you play, but you generally probably only want 1 copy, maybe. Maybe it's like a 2.5 because giving your creature only +1/+1 is generally relatively easy to play around from the opponent, but if you have some Proliferate stuff, you're definitely going to want to be playing cards like Battlefield Promotion in your deck. Next up, we have Bulwark Giant. This type of card makes me think that white might be a more defensive strategy in War of the Spark. Bulwark Giant is just a 6-mana 3/6 that gains you some life. Not generally a very strong card. I think this is going to be a 4, not really a card that you're happy to play, but it's a card that'll make your deck sometimes. And if you're in a more defensive deck, that life gain could come in handy. The cards in white, I do want to say, generally seem to be more defensively oriented than you might expect for white. White is usually a very aggressive combination, but a lot of the cards are defensively statted, or they seem to work pretty well in the late game. So white might be a more controlling color in this set, which is something that we're not really used to. Third common, this is kind of a cool callback to cards like Squadron Hawk that rewards you for getting more copies of a card. Charm Stray, I'm not actually sure. I think it's more of a build around card because it's really bad on its own. A 1-mana 1/1 lifelink is just not playable. But if you have 4 of these and you have 2 on the battlefield and you're buffing them up, it actually could be potentially decent. I'm going to start out with the card not being worth going for, but I could definitely see this being the card you need to get for aggressive decks, because if you are the only person drafting these and you get 5 of them, which isn't super likely, I think on average 3 copies of a common are opened in a draft, but if you got 5 copies of this card, then it would be actually pretty brutal if you went turn 1 Charm Stray, turn 2 Charm Strays. That would be a pretty lethal start, but that's the best case scenario. And so overall, I think this card is going to be unplayable, but definitely a fun card to try at some point in the format. Defiant Strike is next, and this card is interesting. It doesn't generally win you a combat because your creatures are probably just going to be trading anyway, but it doesn't really cost you a card either. So there's 1 uncommon I know that rewards you for targeting it with spells in Boros. So if you have that type of card, Defiant Strike goes up in value, but generally Defiant Strike is a very low impact card, and it just kind of spins your wheels. It doesn't really do a ton to help you win a game of limited, so generally this card is not very good. I'm going to put it at a 4. It's just not really a super solid card, and it's a card that you'll play sometimes, but it's not a super great card. Next up, we have Divine Arrow. This card I have as the number 2 white common, though if white ends up being a more defensive combination, and you just want to be killing aggressive attackers, it could be even better. Though number 1 common is pretty good as well. Divine Arrow is just a very solid removal spell. I think this card is going to be a 3 or even a 3.5. The big downside of this card is that it really doesn't help you kill planeswalkers, because if you're attacking your creature in, the opponent does get that block off, so you don't get to just deal the damage to the planeswalker because you have to destroy a blocking creature. So if you are trying to kill planeswalkers, your opponent still gets that chump block off. Though if you are trying to protect planeswalkers, it does quite a good job of that. So Divine Arrow, I have this card at like a 3.5. It's a very good card, and a card you could take pretty early and be relatively happy with it. Next up, we have Enforcer Griffin. Enforcer Griffin is a card that is going to be very solid in the format, though not anything special. It's just going to be a 3, I think. 3/4 flyer is a very big body. It generally rules the skies, and historically in sets, 3/4s for 5 have been like pretty decent. Cloud Reader Sphinx is a really good example of a very strong 3/4 for 5. That card had Scry 2 attached to it. Enforcer Griffin doesn't have that, but it's definitely still got the body going for it, and is definitely going to be a solid card. I think this is going to be a 3. You're going to play a couple. If you play a couple Enforcer Griffins at the top end of your white deck's curve, it's going to be a pretty good card. It's going to poke through for the damage. It's going to hold off other flyers, and it's just going to be a good card overall. Next up, we have Gideon's Sacrifice. This card, when I first saw it, I was like, wow, this card is going to be disgustingly powerful. And I had it like number 3 white common. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that there are going to be situations where Gideon's Sacrifice blows you out, but there are also going to be a lot of situations where it just doesn't do that much. I do think it is going to be a good card. I think that the first copy in your deck, especially early in the format before people start to play around it, is going to be maybe like a 3.5 even, because there are scenarios where this card just completely destroys your opponent. If the board gets stalled at all, Gideon's Sacrifice becomes incredible, because your opponent, say, attacks you with 3 creatures, you block, like double block one, double block another, and then like chump block a third one, and then you Gideon Sacrifice the one that's chump blocking. You kill 2 of their creatures, you lose 1 of your creatures in a Gideon Sacrifice. But overall, Gideon Sacrifice really does require a lot of work to set up, and it does require a very specific format where there's a lot of board stalls and things like that. So I'm going to start off with Gideon's Sacrifice being a 2.5, a card. The first copy being like a 3 and the second copy being like a 2.5. I think you're going to be able to get a decent amount of value out of the first copy. Maybe you'll have a high toughness creature that can just take the damage and you'll trade a creature. But I think you can like start off playing like 1 copy of this, but I am not optimistic for its chances in the format. I think it's a card that is going to play much worse than it looks on paper. So be very wary of playing with Gideon's Sacrifice. Next up, we have Ironclad Crovad. This is a card that makes me think white might be more defensive, because 4 mana 2/5 is generally not the type of card that white wants. White generally tends to be a beatdown color combination, but an Ironclad Crovad is a 4 mana 2/5, and 2/5s are very, very defensively statted. They can't really attack very well, but they can block very well, and that makes me think that the Crovad is going to be, if playable, it's going to be playable in a more defensive archetype, maybe protecting planeswalkers. So I think this card's going to be a 2 card. You're not really going to want to play it, but sometimes it'll sneak into the deck in more defensive builds. Next up, we have Law Rune Enforcer, a card that I saw kind of discounted, and then I ended up putting it on the top 5 commons list at number 4. I think Law Rune Enforcer is going to be a 3, maybe a 3.5, depending on how the format plays out. It's just really nice to have access to tapper effects. It reminds me of Abyssinian Pilgrim, just a very solid removal spell. And one thing I do want to note is that there is a ton of removal in this set. White has 3 removal spells if you count Law Rune Enforcer, and in the commons alone, and that means that the format is going to play out in a very different way than a lot of formats. Usually you have 2 removal spells in each color, but in this format there's generally 3 removal spells in each color combination, and that means that creatures aren't going to stick around as easily. One important thing to note about Law Rune Enforcer is that it can't tap army tokens, which is actually huge, because those army tokens might get massive, and Law Rune Enforcer really can't tap them. It can tap pretty much everything else that matters, but because they used converted mana cost, it can't tap the armies, which is actually a really cool flavor thing, because if the Law Rune Enforcer was holding back an entire army on his own, it would not really be a flavor success. But I do have this at the number 4 white common. I could see it being the number 3 white common over the Trusted Pegasus, but I generally think that this type of card is going to be a little bit less valuable because it does require that mana investment. So in the early turns, it's not going to be as effective. And if you are a beatdown deck that really wants to be spending its mana on creatures early, Law Rune Enforcer is not going to be as effective either. This card is going to be quite good. And the fact that it doesn't tap army tokens is not as good either. But I think this card is quite good. I think it's going to be a 3 or a 3.5, just a card that you're going to be very happy playing in all of your white decks. Next up, we have Loxodon Sergeant. This card's going to be a 2. You're going to sometimes have to play this type of card. It's more of a 1.5, really. This card's really bad. 4 mana, 3/3 Vigilance is just not a great body, and giving your other creatures Vigilance is just not a very good effect. This card's not very solid, and you're not generally going to be unhappy if you have to play it, but it is marginally playable. Next up, we have Makeshift Battalion. This card is pretty good if you're more of a swarmy white deck. There aren't a ton of like super aggressive white cards in this that we've seen, or there aren't a ton of super aggressive white cards. But Makeshift Battalion is a pretty nice one. If it gets a +1/+1 counter, it's pretty nice. But generally, you have to treat it as like a 3 mana 3/2, which is just not super good. So I think this card's going to be like a 2. If you're attacking with 3 creatures, this card's probably going to get blocked, and it still trades with most 3-drops, so it's still not going to be insane. And it's only really going to snowball out if you're out of control, if you're already just crushing your opponent. Like you go 1-drop, 2-drop Makeshift Battalion, and you're just crushing your opponent already. So generally not a huge fan of the Makeshift Battalion. I think it's just going to be like a 2 or 2.5. Just a card that you'll play sometimes if you need a 3-drop. Next up, we have Martyr for the Cause. This is a card that gets much better the more proliferate you have, the more +1/+1 counters you have, and the more Planeswalkers you have. So if you have like 2 Planeswalkers and 2 cards that care about +1/+1 counters, Martyr for the Cause is like a solid card in your deck, because if you can put a couple counters on things, it's just generally going to be a good card. 2 mana 2/2, you can never go too wrong with that. So I think this card is just going to be a solid 3, just a very decent playable, especially if you work to enable it. Not much to say here. Next up, we have Pouncing Lynx. I have this as the number 5 white common. There are a couple things I do want to note, though. This grade is conditional on there being a white aggressive deck, because this card works really nicely as it's very hard to block in the early stages of the game. That it also depends on how the stat lines end up lining up, because sometimes there are formats where 1/3s, 1/4s are just much better than in other formats, and Pouncing Lynx would really struggle in an environment like that. However, if there are a lot of small creatures running around, especially early on in the game, Pouncing Lynx can do good work. And Pouncing Lynx also works pretty well if you can put some +1/+1 counters on it and proliferate them, because First Strike works really well with creatures that are big. So if you can use Pouncing Lynx, I know it's not a perfect synergy with that combat trick I showed earlier, the one that gives a +1/+1 counter, you gain 2 life for 2 mana. Pouncing Lynx already has First Strike, so it doesn't gain all that much benefit from that, but if you can start proliferating counters onto your Pouncing Lynx, it does still have First Strike on your turn, so it's going to be a decent card. I have this at the number 5 white common. It could be really, and it could end up being wildly unplayable, but I'm going to start out with this being a solid 3, a very solid playable for your deck. Next up, we have Rising Populace. This card is actually pretty tricky to evaluate, because historically cards like this have been like medium. Cards that like this are usually 2 mana 1/1s that grow as creatures die. This does importantly say only creatures that you control, but it does include Planeswalkers. So if this card I think is generally just going to be like a 2.5. It's going to be a card that you'll play sometimes. You're not going to be too unhappy to have to play it, but it's not going to be like the greatest card ever. It does make things a little bit tricky on your opponent, especially because it does get counters onto it, which means you can use Proliferate with it, which is also going to help it as well. But generally, I think Rising Populace is not going to be a super great playable card, and not really a card you're going to be super happy to be playing. So it's a 2 or 2.5. Next up, we have Teo's Light Shield. This card is really going to depend on how good Proliferate ends up being. Teo's Light Shield is putting a counter on a creature may or may not be incredibly valuable depending on how much Proliferate you end up with in a normal deck. There are going to be some decks where you have like 3 or 4 Proliferate cards, and then Teo's Light Shield gains a lot of value, because putting a +1/+1 counter onto your key creature is going to be really nice, especially because unlike a lot of illusions, this card doesn't just die as soon as you target it with something. That'd be a bit of a flavor fail. You play Teo's Light Shield, target it with the +1/+1 counter, and then have to sacrifice it or something. That would be kind of a funny thing. But I think this card is going to be range, depending on your deck, it's going to range from a 2, because a 3 mana 1/4 is like marginally playable, to a 3 in certain decks if you have like 4 or 5 Proliferate cards to get those counters rolling. Next up, we have Topple the Statue. This card is interesting. I will say that it doesn't strike me as the most powerful card, because generally cards like this are just a little bit weak. They kind of just spin your wheels a bit. You can use them kind of on offense, kind of on defense, and it does cycle, which means it can never be too bad. That being said, it is 3 mana, and 3 mana for this kind of effect could be pretty hard to swing. If there are a ton of massive armies running around and you just need to buy that extra turn, Topple the Statue could be pretty nice, but I generally see this card as being a card that you'll like slot in, and towards the end of your card pool, you'll be like, okay, I need a couple extra playables. I guess I'll play a Topple the Statue. It doesn't really strike me as like a featured card. That being said, it does have a decent effect. It does replace itself, so it can't ever really be that bad. I think I'm going to give this card a 2.5 rating. Next up, we have Trusted Pegasus. This card is incredible. I have it at the number 3 white common over the Law Rune Enforcer because this card has just historically been great. It's like welcome back Pegasus Courser, welcome back Rock Charger. This card is so good in all of the aggressive decks in every format it's been in. Usually it's a 1/3, but as a 2/2 it's even better for those decks a lot of the time because those decks tend to be aggressive. And Trusted Pegasus is just going to do good work in this format. If there is an aggressive deck in white, which there usually is, Trusted Pegasus is going to be a key component. You're going to want to draft as many copies of this as you can get, and the fact that it has that second power makes it even better than those previous iterations have been for the aggressive deck. So Trusted Pegasus is going to get a solid 3.5. Definitely a card you're going to want to pursue aggressively, and definitely a card that is going to be a key player in this format, especially if aggressive decks are good. Even if aggressive decks aren't good, this card is like a 3-mana 2/2 flyer on its own, which is just a fine card. And then later on in the game, it can help you jump your other creatures, which is just very good. So 3.5 for that. Wanderer Strike I have as the number 1 white common. It's hard to go wrong with a Wanderer Strike. I think the second copy is much worse than the first copy, but the first copy is going to be a 3.5 in almost every deck. Just exiling target creature. It doesn't get a death trigger. It's just gone for good, and then you proliferate. So that could even like power up your planeswalkers a little bit more. Wanderer Strike is going to be very good. It does mean that, as I've said, there are a lot of removal spells in white, so all of the removal spells lose a little bit of value when there are so many other removal spells. That's just kind of how it works. If you like see an early Wanderer Strike, you don't necessarily have to jump on it because you could just see a Divine Arrow or a Law Rune Enforcer a little bit later. But Wanderer Strike is going to be quite good, especially if you have a couple of +1/+1 counters running around in your deck. And if you do have cards like Wanderer Strike in your deck, you do want to prioritize the +1/+1 counters a little bit higher because you want to make sure that you can gain some value out of those proliferate triggers. So yeah, that is going to be my pick for number 1 common, though really a lot of these commons are very powerful. Pouncing Lynx is definitely a step below the other commons in this section, but it is still going to be a very solid card. Next up, we are going to talk about the uncommons. I didn't really bother ranking the uncommons because top 5 uncommons, there's only like 9 of them, so like that doesn't really do a ton, but definitely going to go through them as well. I'll just leave the top 5 commons up there so that you know what I'm talking about, so that you can like remember those. Number first up, we're going to talk about Ajani's Pridemate. Ajani's Pridemate is a card. There we go. Ajani's Pridemate is a card that generally needs some work to be a good, but it really has a very high floor as well. The fact that it works with the +1/+1 counter combat trick incredibly well is a really good sign for Ajani's Pridemate because you can probably get a couple copies of that combat trick. And then Ajani's Pridemate is going to be very strong for you because that combat trick essentially gives +2/+2 in first strike. And then Ajani's Pridemate works really well with Proliferate. So I think Ajani's Pridemate is going to be a 3.5 in this format. Even though there isn't a ton of life gain running around, there is enough life gain that you're going to be able to get a counter on Ajani's Pridemate. And then it's one of the easiest things because there's a lot of Proliferate as well. So you'll just be able to get a bunch of counters onto your Ajani's Pridemate, and it can potentially take over the game. And as a worst case scenario, it is a 2-mana 2/2. So I think Ajani's Pridemate is going to be a 3.5. Next up, we have Bond of Discipline. I think this card is going to be a 1. I said it. I really love the flavor of the bonds. There's a bond for a lot of the 2-color pairs. This represents that Azorius and Orzhov are kind of bonding together, which I think is super cool. I really like that aspect of it. But I mean, because they both share white in common, which is cool. But I do want to say, I do think that Bond of Discipline isn't very good. 5 mana to not add to the board in any significant way. The creatures don't even stay tapped for an extra turn, and even though you're gaining lifelink, that's generally only going to help if you're already winning or you're in a very stalled board. So Bond of Discipline, not really going to be getting there for me. I think it's a 1. I think it's unplayable, and I think you should avoid playing it in your decks. Just imagine a scenario where you're behind. Bond of Discipline does nothing because you can't really attack because you're going to need to keep your guys for blocking. If you're at parity, sure, maybe you get a big alpha attack in, but then they kind of just set their guys back up and you're down a card. I just can't see Bond of Discipline being playable, though I do love the flavor. Gideon's Triumph is a really good card. It is basically a Celestial Purge, I think. No, not Celestial Purge. I can't remember the name of the card. It was back in Magic Origins. It was like white for this type of effect. But the fact that it can kill any sized creature is really nice. It does get a little bit worse because Divine Arrow is in the set, so your opponent's not just going to jam their massive blocker in front of your creature because it could just get Divine Arrowed, which is a common. But Gideon's Triumph can definitely kill creatures that are bigger than Divine Arrow, and it's just extra copies of Divine Arrow. I'm going to rate it about the same as Divine Arrow because you're never going to have a Gideon in Limited, or very rarely going to have a Gideon because the Gideon in this set is a mythic. But also the Gideon's Triumph just does basically the same thing as a Divine Arrow. So Divine Arrow is going to be like a 3.5. Gideon's Triumph is going to be like a 3.5 or 3, depending on how many copies you have, because how many removal spells you have, what you need, deck context. things like that. If you're more defensive, this type of card gets better because the creature doesn't get to block before. As I said before, it's like better for protecting planeswalkers than for killing planeswalkers, but still going to be a very good card. So 3.5, good card. Grateful Apparition is a card that I think gets much better the more +1/+1 counters you have, and if you have a couple planeswalkers, it gets very kind of scary. Very scary. But I think it's overall going to just be a very medium card. I think that there are going to be much fewer +1/+1 counters than you anticipate when you have a card like Grateful Apparition in your deck, though there are going to be some decks where it is very strong. So I'm going to start off with this card being like a 2, a card that you don't really want to play because a 2-mana 1/1 flyer is just not very good. But if you have, say, a Planeswalker and like 4 ways to put +1/+1 counters on your creatures, then Grateful Apparition moves up to a 3 maybe. So I think this is the type of card that's going to start out not being very good, but then generally as you gain more and more counters, it gets better and better. So keep that in mind. That's why part of the reason I don't love giving a grade for cards is because cards like Grateful Apparition are so contextual to your specific deck. And if I just say, oh, it's a 2, then people are going to never play it, even though in a lot of decks it's going to be good. It's just in a lot of other decks it's just not going to be very good. So Grateful Apparition really is deck dependent, but it could be range from very medium to very mediocre to very solid. So I think it's just going to be a 2 or like a 2 to 3 range type card. Next up, we have Prison Realm. This card is going to be a 4, just very efficient removal. Kills anything, any size, and you get a scry. It can exile creatures or planeswalkers, which is just very, very solid. Prison Realm is going to be a 4, just one of the cards that you have it, and it just makes you want to play that color. I'm very, very high on Prison Realm. It's very hard not to be. It's basically Oblivion Ring with an extra scry attached, and Oblivion Ring is already a very, very good card. So Prison Realm, definitely a solid card. And all the art's pretty good, too. I like it. I like it. Next up, we have Rally of Wings. I think this card is unplayable. That's right. I think this card is garbage, and you should not be putting in your deck, because you're generally in Limited not going to have a ton of flyers. So untapping all your creatures just doesn't do a ton. Say you have like a couple of creatures that you're attacking with, and then you get to untap them and eat a creature from the opponent. That's like the only scenario where you're ever going to use this for card parity. A lot of the times you're going to be untapping your creatures and then like double blocking or something like that, and then you're down, you 2-for-1 yourself. The fact that it only buffs your flyers means that it's maybe more of a constructed card where you're going to have a all flyers deck. But in Limited, you're going to have like 3 flyers, maybe 4 flyers if you're really lucky. You just don't generally have a ton of flyers. So Rally of Wings, I think, is going to be pretty bad, unless, of course, you get like 6 Trusted Pegasus, and then all of your creatures are going to have flying all the time, and then you just buff them all, and then you just swing, and yeah, it's not going to happen. Rally of Wings is unplayable. I don't think you should play this card. Though, at your pre-release, people might play it, so if they have a big creature and they make a really silly attack and have 2 white men up, you know what's happening. Next up, we have Sunblade Angel, and this is a card that I think has high potential, because if you can somehow put a +1/+1 counter on it, think that one combat trick that can put +1/+1 counters on stuff. Sunblade Angel can get, like, wears counters incredibly well. So if you can put +1/+1 counters onto it, I'm just going to look up what that card's called, because that card's grown on me the more I've talked about cards. Battlefield Promotion is just, like, potentially a very strong card in this set. So if you have a lot of these cards that care about Battlefield Promotion, maybe just take Battlefield Promotion a little bit higher. Maybe I should have put that as a number 5 white common, but enough of that. Sunblade Angel is the type of card that wears counters very well. Even without counters, it's still a very solid top-end card. Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, Lifelink. It's going to stabilize the board in a lot of cases. It does die to a lot of removal. It dies to Divine Arrow. It dies to Divine Arrows, which means like it could just get. It dies to a lot of the burn spells. It dies to a lot of the black removal. It just dies to everything, which means that it's a potentially risky top-end play, and generally plays like this can go very poorly. But in the right deck, I think it could definitely be a solid 3. But in a lot of other decks, it's going to be just too expensive or not really going to be as good. I think format contextually, though, this card's going to be very solid. So it's like a 3.5 in a lot of decks, because you want to be able to attack while also defending planeswalkers, and Sunblade Angel plays both sides of that coin very well. And if you can ever get a counter on it and start proliferating, this card's going to win you the game. So you kind of have to build around it to make it a 3.5, but I think baseline is going to probably be a 3. It reminds me a little bit of like the 6-drop from Ravnica Allegiance. That was also a 3/3 First Strike flyer, but this having Vigilance and Lifelink is pretty nice as well. So I think Sunblade Angel is going to be a 3.5 card in this set. And next up, we have Teo the Shield Mage. Teo the Shield Mage is a very interesting one, because you having Hexproof and Limited is basically no text, and then creating a couple of O3s is also kind of like mediocre. So I think Teo is actually kind of like a very like meh planeswalker, like not very good. I think it's more of a 2. Some defensive decks might want to run it, especially if you get Huatli. The Huatli planeswalker like makes all of your defenders deal damage with your toughness, I think. Something like that. Creatures deal damage with their toughness. And then having a couple 3/3 walls is actually decent. But the Teo the Shield Mage on his own is just kind of a 2. You'll play him sometimes when you really need some extra defensive stuff. But 0/3s don't even block that well. They only block like 2 drops usually, because a lot of 3 drops have 3 power. They don't block flyers. They don't have reach. So Teo the Shield Mage, generally not a very good card. I think I'm actually going to make him just a 1.5. Just not a very good card in Limited. Unless, of course, you have a Defender's deck. The Wanderer, however, is quite a nice card. Prevent all non-combat damage that we dealt to you and other permanents you control is actually a very relevant line of text, because it just really shuts down burn spells. It also shuts down... there's a card in green that kind of like deals damage with your creatures, but it's not combat damage. It's like a fight spell kind of, but it's like a punch spell, shall we say. It's like a rabid bite effect, but it's like with 2 creatures teaming up. I forget the name of it, but that is also non-combat damage. So that's actually a pretty relevant line of text. And then exiling a creature with power 4 or greater is actually really relevant in this set. It's because of how prevalent those creatures are going to be. A mass armies are going to be like relatively big a lot of the time, and so the Wanderer is oftentimes going to have a target. It's also going to make things really tricky for your opponent that's playing a mass cards, because their army might be like a 3/3, but then if they play any of their mass cards, it grows to a 4/4, and then your Wanderer can kill it. So it's going to be a nice little tricky game. I think the Wanderer is actually going to be a very solid card. I think it's going to be a 3.5. There's going to be a decent amount of value that you can get from the Wanderer, both blanking opponents' cards. And keep in mind, a lot of the time, the way they're going to kill your Planeswalker is by removing your creature and then attacking it. But that doesn't always work with the Wanderer, based on like certain colors, just removal just not lining up against the Wanderer. And then it can also just come down and exile a creature, which is just nice value. And it can do it twice, so it really screws those army tokens over. So the Wanderer, I think, is going to be a 3.5. Just a very solid card, and just it's cool to have that type of thing in the set. Okay, that is going to do it for the uncommons. The rares for white coming up. There are some very silly rares in white, but there are also some very broken rares. The finale, we're going to go starting with Finale of Glory. Finale of Glory, there we go, is a very strong card. This card's a 5. It is a sorcery, but if you make... Just imagine all the scenarios. For 4 mana, you're making 2 2/2s, which is like a Gallant Cavalry, which is like solid. If you go to 5, you're making 3 2/2s. If you go to 6, you're making 4 2/2 creatures. That's 8 power, 8 toughness on 4 bodies. It's just unbelievable. And the more mana you pump into it, the better. So this card is unbelievable. Definitely a 5.0 card. Very, very good. And there's going to be a lot of glory if you have this card in your deck. You're just going to win the game a lot of the time you cast it. You don't really necessarily want to cast it for 4 mana. But sometimes you have to if you're a defensive, and that's just really nice flexibility to have on a card. And if you ever get to 10 mana, send me a screenshot of that stuff. That's going to be awesome. You're just going to have like 20 creatures on the battlefield. That's unbelievable. I can't imagine anyone losing a game after doing that. That would be hilarious if someone like did that and then their opponent had like one like of the like a board sweeper in their deck. But yeah, Finale of Glory, 5 stars. Gideon Blackblade, also going to be 5 stars. It's a little bit less flexible than Finale of Glory in that it's going to be 5.0 in like an aggressive deck, and then like a 4.5 in like a less aggressive deck. But this card is still incredible. 3 mana 4/4 indestructible attacker that can give your other creatures lifelink indestructible vigilance when they're attacking is just unbelievable. And then eventually you'll exile permanents with it. It starts out with like 5 loyalty. Just incredible card. Getting Blackblade, definitely going to be a card that you want to play in every deck. I'm just going to say it. It's a 5.0 in every deck. It's not a 4.5 even in controlling decks. In this set, you're going to have creatures because you want to protect your planeswalkers in general, and getting Blackblade does require other creatures, but like even on its own, it's like kind of hard to like deal with because you have to have more than like 2 powered up creatures, and you don't have to have any. You have to have somebody to protect Gideon, but like he's a 5.0. He's unbelievable. Oketra, God Eternal Oketra is even better than those last 2 cards, I think, because Finale of Glory or whatever that card still requires you to get up to like 6 mana for it to win you the game. I mean, Oketra, as Finale of Glory. I mean, all these cards are unbelievable. All the mythics in white are generally like really, really insane. This card, 5 mana 3/6 double strike. Whenever you cast a creature spell, in addition to that creature, you make a 4/4 black zombie creature that has vigilance. Why does it have vigilance? It doesn't make any sense. This card is disgustingly powerful, and you can't even kill it because if it dies or is put into exile, you put it into an Ono Vibrate third from the top, and there aren't any like enchantment removal spells. Even if there were enchantment removals, it's just sitting in play doing that. Oh my gosh, this card is unbelievable. Unbelievable. This card is probably the best mythic in white, and that's saying something because the other ones are insane too. But God Eternal Catcher, definitely a 5. Yeah, I can't imagine losing the game once you put this into play. Like, disgustingly powerful. Disgusting. Oh my gosh. Holy smokes. Yeah, this card is incredible. Very good. 5.0, 5.0. Ignite the Beacon. If you have 2 Planeswalkers in your deck, I don't think this is playable, because if you draw one of the Planeswalkers before you draw Ignite the Beacon, it's a 5-mana cantrip. But if you have like 4 Planeswalkers in your deck, 5 mana to draw 2 potentially very powerful cards, because you could just have a very strong Planeswalker, could actually be good enough. So Ignite the Beacon, I think unplayable if you have 2 Planeswalkers, marginally playable, maybe like a 2.0 if you have 3 Planeswalkers. And then if you have 4 Planeswalkers, it like gets to a 2.5. Almost. Oh, 1 second. Sorry about that. Yeah, Ignite the Beacon, it gets better and better the more Planeswalkers you have. If you have 4 Planeswalkers, it becomes like a solid playable in your deck, because you're tutoring out 2 cards, potentially situational cards, because Planeswalkers in this set are often situational, and Ignite the Beacon is going to be a very solid card if you have 4 Planeswalkers. But other than that, if you have 3 Planeswalkers, it's a 2. If you have 4, it's a 3. And if you have 2, it's a 1. I can't imagine having more than 4 Planeswalkers, but if you have more than 4, it's like, yeah, you're liking Ignite the Beacon. I don't think it's a card that you'll take early just so you can potentially take all the Planeswalkers. Parhelion 2. Parhelion 2 is a card that, if you ever get an attack with Parhelion 2, you're going to win the game. But I think it's generally going to be, like, not great. The set does strike me as a slower set, so the Crew 4 might be less of a downside than it normally would be. I mean, the 8 mana cost might be less of a downside because the set might be very slow, but even then, 8 mana is an insane amount of mana. So Parhelion 2 is generally going to be unplayable, but if you have a dedicated ramp deck and have some other big creatures, this card could be a very nice top-end payoff. So if you do have the chance to draft it, maybe it could be okay. And in Sealed, it gets a little bit better because you generally can get to the late game a little bit easier in Sealed. So I think in Sealed, Parhelion is a little bit more playable, but generally it's unplayable in draft. So because 8 mana spells are just generally unplayable in draft. Though if the format is slow enough or you build your deck around it, it could be a decent finisher. Ravnica at War, I think is going to be unplayable, but I'm not sure because anything's possible on Ravnica. Exiling all multicolored permanents, like, you can't build your deck in such a way that your cards aren't multicolored. Like, a lot of the Planeswalkers are multicolored. Like, a lot of the most powerful cards you could be playing are multicolored, so you don't want to, like, handicap yourself by playing, like, a mono white deck that just doesn't have any multicolored cards. So it's like going to be relatively symmetrical a lot of the time you draw it, and your opponent also is probably not going to have a ton of multicolored permanents anyway. So I think Ravnica at War is just unplayable. Though maybe if they have some unbeatable like Planeswalker, you can side this in. Like if they have a NicolaiBolas in their deck, I would probably side this in. Like, okay, I have one way to kill NicolaiBolas, I guess, that type of thing. Single Combat is a very strong card because you can build your deck around it and they can't. So it's a symmetrical effect. Each player gets to keep a creature or Planeswalker, and then they can't cast creature or Planeswalker spells until the end of my next turn. So first of all, the opponent is going to get to start developing their stuff first, but I know that Single Combat is coming, so I can set up the board in such a way where I maybe like quadruple block their big creature and let them have all their small creatures, and then I have my one big creature left standing, and then I keep my like 5/5 and they have a 2/2. So Single Combat definitely has a lot of potential, and I think could be a very solid card. I think it's going to be a 3.5, maybe. It's just going to be a 4.0 card. Single Combat is going to be a very solid rare in this set because you're going to be able to play around it and set up good things. So Single Combat, definitely a good rare to take. Next, we have Atomic Distinguished Advocatist. All of its abilities are irrelevant and limited except for flying, but a 2-mana 2/3 flyer is pretty good. That being said, it does require double white, so even a lot of the time in your limited deck, you're not going to be able to cast it on turn 2. So I think Atomic is just a solid playable. It's going to be a 3, because 2/3 flyers are going to be good, but it's maybe going to be a 3.5 because if you do cast it on turn 2, it's so good. But generally, just going to be a 2/3 flyer. It's going to perform pretty well, and it's going to be a solid plus, shall we say, card. Anyway, that is going to do it for all of the rares, commons, and uncommons, I don't know why I said it, and mythics in White for War of the Spark. If you have any questions at all about the cards, be sure to leave those in the comment section down below. If you would like to see future videos of War of the Spark set reviews for the different colors, be sure to hit that thumbs up button. Remember, we're trying to get to 50 thumbs up, and also be sure to subscribe to get updates whenever I post new content. That is going to do it for this video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. Good luck at your pre-release, and I will talk to you in my next video.